Okay, we're finishing now part 2, chapter 2. And what we've said so far is that people have free will and their actions are, some are good and some are evil. And by the way, the Rambam writes explicitly that everyone has some good actions and some bad actions. Everyone. And he takes it for granted that there'll be a variety. And we talked about the fact that this world and the next world are asymmetrical. The next world is where the majority of a person's actions, which determine his identity, are compensated. For the righteous, they exist in the world to come and they're rewarded. And for those whose major complexion is black, are excluded from the world to come. And in this world, the minority is addressed. The wicked who are going to be lost in the world to come get compensated, rewarded for their good actions in this world. And the righteous will be punished in this world for the minority of bad actions that they have. And the Chal notes at the end of the chapter, this begins an explanation of why righteous people suffer. This is a big deal, righteous people suffering. It's one of the most famous complaints against religious belief, to believe in an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God. It's hard to understand why righteous people suffer. Maimonides says that this is the root of all rebellions against religious belief. They spell themselves out in discussions about divine providence, and divine foreknowledge, and free will, and omnipotence, and so on and so on. That's how they spell themselves out. But the root of it is this motivation that you can't explain the evil in the world. And by the way, I saw a quote from a letter written by Darwin. He grew up as a religious person. And what set him off was seeing parasites in the natural world. Parasites attach themselves to organisms and destroy the organisms. And he couldn't imagine how a good God could allow a world like that. And that's what set him off on his explorations and examinations of different ways to understand how life developed without divine input and so on and so on. To me, it was fascinating to find that Darwin describes on his own that this was his initial motivation. And as we will going through the principles of providence, which he will have in the next chapter, there are many such principles that describe why righteous people suffer. But we have one already. So it means merely seeing righteous people suffer can't be used as an argument against the Torah system, because the Torah says explicitly that will happen. Now, what we haven't explained is why, and he says this himself, he says this himself, we haven't explained why righteous people will experience good in this world. Because what we have said is that the true compensation for a mitzvah is in the world to come. And that wicked people get compensation in this world because they don't have a world to come to compensate it in. And is that true compensation? We gave the explanation that either they made themselves impossible to receive, or they put their own value on the action so that they're paid off in their own currency. But that shouldn't apply to righteous people. So the question is why righteous people get any good things in this world, any good benefits in this world, since the reward for their good deeds is going to be put off to the world to come. And he says here that he'll discuss in the next chapter. Okay, now, the next chapter starts with an extremely fundamental principle. It is noted, I think, in all aspects of Jewish literature, but it's especially prominent in the Kabbalah. I'm going to translate for you what he writes in the first couple of paragraphs, line by line, and then we will discuss it in some detail. We already explained that the task that was given to man is dependent upon his being created in a world where there are aspects of good and aspects of evil, and he's placed between them to choose for himself the good. Now, there are many, many different aspects of good and many different aspects of evil, some of which he will discuss in detail in the next paragraph. There are many different good character traits, and he told us in chapter 2 that good in general is intellectual understanding and good character traits, and evil in general is physicality and bad character traits. And here he's going to be talking about character traits, and as you know very well, there are many different good character traits, and their opposites are many different bad characteristics. And the actions that are required for each vary. And he sets up the relationship between the character traits as good and evil as opposites. I'm just mentioning it because we spoke about the Rambam's description, and the Rambam's description was different and much more sophisticated. The Rambam had a spectrum, and it was a spectrum of more and less, of some quality, and the two extremes of the spectrum were both bad, and the middle area was good. Here you have a much simpler classification. There are good characteristics and the opposite, bad characteristics, and there are many of them. Like, for example, he says, pride is a bad characteristic, and anova, which we have to discuss what it means exactly, you could call it humility, is the opposite of something, which is something good. Mercy is something good, and cruelty is something bad. Now he puts together two things which I could talk about at the moment. Being satisfied and rejoicing in the portion that God gives you is a good character trait, and the opposite, being dissatisfied and being bitter about what you have, is a bad character trait. And so it is for all the other character traits of the human being. They come in pairs of good and bad. Now, wisdom for humanity requires acquiring all the good character traits. Each of the good character traits is a perfection. Total perfection would be acquiring all of them. But there is a very difficult contradiction in that idea, because the conditions that are required to acquire one type of perfection are the opposite of conditions that are required to acquire an opposite type of perfection. The person's life circumstances aren't suitable for acquiring all good characteristics. And he gives a very important example here. He says, take, for example, poverty and wealth. So now, first of all, let's suppose there wasn't any such thing as poverty and wealth. Let's just suppose everybody has all that he needs, and everybody's satisfied with all that he needs. So he says, if that's the case, there wouldn't be an opportunity to face the challenge of choosing generosity over selfishness, sympathy over cruelty, because that choice is where a well-to-do person confronts a person who's in need and has to decide how to respond to him. Shall I share what I have, or shall I be selfish? Shall I identify with his suffering, or shall I be cruel and indifferent? It's the fact that some people are rich and some people are poor that gives the opportunity to develop these particular good character traits. And of course, the character traits that I just mentioned are the character traits of the wealthy person. His perfection will be in being generous. His perfection will be in being sympathetic. The poor person doesn't have the same opportunity. He may be living from hand to mouth. Be generous. He may not even be able to be generous with his time, because he's putting all his effort into just surviving. So The challenge of developing generosity requires that there be those people who have for themselves and a surplus, and those people who need, and being able for the one to confront the other. And then he goes on. Let me finish this description of these two characters because it's quite detailed here. The poor person is going to be tested with whether he can be satisfied with the little that he has, and that he can acknowledge Hashem, thank Hashem for it, even though it's little. He can say, "This is enough for me, and I'm sure it's assigned to me. I'm sure it's right for me, even though I don't have all that I would like." Or he won't do that. So the perfection available to the poor person is a different perfection from that which is available to the rich person. And in addition, the rich person is going to be tested to see whether, because he has wealth, he becomes haughty, his heart is lifted up, or he'll be drawn after the follies of this world because he has the money to afford it, and he will abandon his service of the Creator. Or, with all of his wealth, he will be humble, and nichna means he'll sort of place himself beneath other people. He'll give in to other people, and he'll feel that the pleasures of this world are degraded, and he will choose Torah and service. Those are the challenges that you have for a rich person. So already you see that you're not going to have a life condition for a human being that will enable him to acquire all possible virtues. Now, if you take this seriously and use your imagination, you can see that this has unlimited numbers of spin-offs. Okay, wealthy. How did he get wealthy? Did he earn it himself, or did he inherit it? Those are two different challenges. The challenge of earned wealth is the challenge of, did I make it for myself? Am I the clever one who created it? Is it my effort that brought it about? Can I take credit for it? The challenge for the person who inherits it is not that, because he didn't create it. But his challenge is, I'm a better person. I come from better stock. I'm in a better class. Irrespective of what I do, it's just what I am. It's a different type of challenge. Having said that, what about a person who worked and earned a lot of money and spent 20 years wealthy and then lost it? His challenge is not going to be the challenge of a person who's always been poor. And what about a person who worked and was wealthy and lost it all and then earned it back, or then was given it by inheritance? All these variations create different human circumstances and somewhat different human challenges. Now, the original plan was for somehow to combine in a single pair of individuals, Adam and Chava, the sum total of all human possibilities and give them a challenge which would simultaneously perfect all human character. That was all wrapped up into the tree of knowledge. When they failed, the highest wisdom, which he keeps referring to in those terms, decided to split the task up so that each person's life circumstances, in much more detail than I spelled out, but you can begin to see how the details of the circumstances are going to change the qualities of the opportunities, that the sum total of human perfection should be achieved through millions or billions of people, all making their contribution by facing their particular life circumstances and acquiring the particular type of perfection that's available under those conditions. Okay, now let's imagine we have a person whose chosen slice of perfection that he has to provide is living in poverty. That's what he has to provide. or living with pain, or living with illness, or living with tragedy. That can be his share in achieving human perfection. That means it doesn't matter what he does. It has nothing to do with his actions. He'll never escape it. He can pray with the utmost sincerity, won't matter, because that's what he was put in the world to conquer. This is something called Mazel Elyon. This is unchangeable because that's the definition of his challenge. Here you have a very dramatic explanation of the suffering of the righteous. Because the conditions you live under are not totally under the control of your actions. Some of them are irrespective of your actions. Sometimes poverty or illness or whatever is a challenge, and sometimes the challenge is to respond in the right way, in which case it could be changed. But sometimes it can't be changed. So, to read from your life circumstances the quality of your service of God is a terrible mistake. We saw one reason for that a few moments ago from the previous chapter, but this is going to be a gigantic one. Here's an example of where it can go wrong. Avram and Sarah didn't have children for decades. Finally, Sarah says to Avram, she says to him, I want children. I don't have children. If you look at the verses carefully, you'll see that her motivation was that he should have children, not she should have children. He should have children through her. But that's what she says. That's a long story. I'm not going to go into it. I'm just pointing it out. Okay, so she says, take my maidservant as a wife and live with her, and maybe through my doing that, I'll be built up and I will also have children. That's what she says. Okay, so Hagar is now living also with Abraham. She becomes pregnant. And when she becomes pregnant, she starts treating Sarah with contempt, with degradation, with disrespect. Sarah says to Abraham, my anger is directed at you. I gave my maidservant to you as a wife, and now she treats me with contempt. May God judge between you and me. This outburst of anger was wrong on her part, and she was punished for it. But in the meantime, what's she angry about? Why is she angry at Abraham? Now, one explanation is a very simple explanation. Hagar's living with them. She was an Egyptian princess, by the way, who volunteered to serve in Abraham's house because being a servant in Abraham's house is more glorious and wonderful and meaningful than being an Egyptian princess. And she sees they have no children. Why do they have no children? Well, you can't tell. Maybe it's his fault. Maybe it's her fault. Maybe it's both of them. Something's wrong, but you can't tell. Now, she becomes pregnant, so Hagar says, aha! So it's Sarah's fault. She presents herself as such a pious, righteous person. She's a phony. She's a phony. If she were so pious and righteous, God wouldn't let her suffer not having children. She's a phony. Why should I respect her? Sarah's complaint to Abraham is, why didn't you prepare her for this? Why didn't you teach her what I just said, that God doesn't give goodies to the righteous people? They don't get more ice cream cones. Righteous people can suffer. Not only was Sarah barren, according to the tradition, all seven, the three patriarchs and the four matriarchs, all of them were barren. Because God wanted the creation of the first line of Jews to be miraculous, not natural. That has nothing to do with their being righteous. On the contrary, because they're so righteous, because they're so pious, and they're going to be the foundation of the whole Jewish people, their reproduction should be miraculous. But Hagar didn't know that. She read it as if God loves you, he'd have given you a child, and therefore God doesn't love you, and therefore you're a phony in terms of claiming to serve God. People who use the suffering of the righteous as an argument against the Jewish religion, this one principle alone puts it underwater. Because no one can tell. No one can tell how to divide up all the possible characteristics that human beings have, and how much suffering is necessary to develop this particular aspect of this particular characteristic. This one principle alone can sink that problem. Questions up to here? Yeah.
But doesn't the problem something like a baby still remain? Because a baby would be righteous because it's innocent.
Right, but I specifically said the suffering of the righteous. Now, as far as babies are concerned, the only answer that I know to that is reincarnation. That applies to babies as well. I'm a little disturbed by the fact that the Rambam doesn't ever, as far as I have seen, doesn't ever raise the question. He talks about good and evil and righteousness and people's performance and God's reward and punishment a lot. He never raises the question. And so far as I know, he doesn't have reincarnation available. Though there is one little hint, and if you can share this with others and see the reaction that you get. I've mentioned it to people, I've gotten really blank faces, and maybe somebody knows something about it that I don't know. It's just being recorded, so you can ask people. Rav Saadia Gaon, who lived about 100 years before the Rambam, explicitly rejects reincarnation. He says it's not a Jewish idea. The Rambam writes quite completely, comprehensively about various ideas, whether they are genuine or not, in the Jewish tradition. He takes ideas even found in the Talmud and rejects them because he feels that they are contradicted by other passages in the Talmud, and therefore, and so forth and so on. He never mentions it. He never mentions it. I would have expected, if he rejected it, and it was a well-known idea that some people associated with Judaism, that he would mention it and reject it, since, as a matter of fact, the question had been raised 100 years earlier by someone whom everyone knew. He never mentions it. So I'm a little suspicious that there's something under the cover going on here. He never raises the chief problem for which you need reincarnation as an answer, and he never mentions reincarnation to reject it. So I'm not saying this proves anything, but it does raise the eyebrows. That you should think about it a little bit. But that's the only answer that I know that works for that. Yeah.
Could a possible explanation be, I don't know if this is corroborated at all in the Jewish sources, but can God essentially remove the suffering from the baby's perspective so that if a baby suffers, the only point of the baby suffering is for the effect on the world around it, whereas the soul itself, God makes it so that soul isn't actually suffering.
So that kind of idea is used elsewhere, not in the Rambam's corpus. Especially in the Kabbalistic corpus, it is used. But to associate it with the Rambam, it would be, at most, only a mere possibility. It wouldn't be something that we could verify, at least that I could verify. Yeah.
So then we could say, to some extent, that the level of providence is so hard that we ourselves serve one to each other, for us to actually find this very little spot of free will, which means to make the effort to take the good out of the way the providence is shaping us, and when we ourselves in that, their free will is basically perhaps to make the effort of serving Hashem, like that would be like,
So I'll tell you. Let me elaborate a little bit. I hinted at this when I mentioned Mazan Elyon. There's a thesis that talks about it. There's that talks about it. In our literature, you have the idea of mazel. Mazel is some kind of heavenly power that dictates your circumstances. Now, some will tell you, but it says in the Talmud, Ein mazel Yisrael. The Jewish people doesn't have that kind of mazel. And as always, you can't understand a statement in the Talmud by taking out the dictionary and looking it up like a 6-year-old. I'll tell you where the Gemara discusses this. There's a story about, interestingly enough, the great Jewish scholar named Shmuel, who had a friend who was an idol worshiper, and they spent time together and conversed together. And one occasion, they were sitting together, and a group of Jewish workers went out to go cut reeds in the forest. And the non-Jew's name was Ablat. And Ablat said to Shmuel, that one's not coming back. He's going to die out there. And Shmuel said he didn't agree. So hours later, they come back, and they're all there. So Shmuel calls that worker over and he says, your sack full of the cut reeds, empty it out. He empties it out in front of him, and in it is a poisonous snake, which was sliced in half by the tool that the worker was using to cut the reeds. So Shmuel said to the person, did anything unusual happen to you today? Anything happen in the course of the day that could possibly be responsible for this? And the worker said, well, here's what we do for lunch. Everybody brings food, and we put it into a common store, and then we share it out. And I'm the one who collects the food and shares it out. One of the company today didn't have any food, didn't to put it in. I pretended to put in food for him also, and then when I shared it out, I gave him a portion. So Shmuel said, the verse says, Tzedakah tatzil mimoves, charity saves from death. And the Gemara says, from here you see that ein mazal Yisrael. There is no heavenly power dictating what happens to Jews. So Taisa says, excuse me, take another look at the story. Wasn't there a snake waiting for him? Was Ablat just dreaming? Was he making a mistake or predicting for a Jew? There was a poisonous snake waiting for that worker. And what did Shmuel say? Well, maybe you did something to avoid that poisonous snake. And he said, I engaged in an act of charity. And Shmuel said, yes, charity can save from death. So Tosfos says, when the Gemara says, Ein Mazel Yisrael, it means that we have a mazel, and the mazel dictates the conditions that we are living under, but we can transcend the mazel. We can transcend it. It's not zero, it's not absent, but we have means by which we can transcend it. And that means can, but might not, and we have to do something extraordinary, and under those conditions we can transcend it. And this is actually the message of a famous incident in the life of Abraham, where God says to Abraham, I promise you children. And Abraham says, I looked in the stars and I saw that the heavenly power that's dictating the conditions of my life says no children. So it says, God took him outside and he took him above the stars. By the way, in the Hebrew it's habet no hashamayma, gaze now towards the heavens, and lahabit in Hebrew means to look down, not up. That's why Chazal say that he took him above the heavens. He said, yes, there's a heavenly power that says no children, but you can go above the heavens. So Ein Mazel Yisrael doesn't mean there aren't any heavenly powers that are involved. They are involved, but they can be transcended. Okay. So now, there's such a thing as Mazel Elyon and Mazel Tachton. When I tell you that you're put in the world to face a certain particular circumstance and to succeed in creating a certain set of virtues under those circumstances, that's the Mazel Elyon. I told you that's unchangeable. But the Mazel Tachton dictates the means that you have in those circumstances to be able to achieve those virtues. But the means could change. The goal can't change, but the means could change. So, for example, Rav Dessler gives this example. Let's suppose a person is put in the world to strengthen the study of Torah. And he's born into a poor village, and he's got a good head, and he has good study habits, and he joins the people in this village who are learning Torah and living a very, very modest lifestyle, and by his own learning, he's promoting the study of Torah. And he's very disturbed at being poor. This bothers him. And he prays to God that he shouldn't be poor. So it can happen that God will enable him to have a lot of money. He'll move out of the village. He'll move to a large city. And he'll take up residence there. And then the Jewish institutions of Torah study will come to him for support. And then he'll have the challenge of supporting them generously so as to promote Jewish learning. So either he'll promote Jewish learning by doing the learning himself in a poor village as a poor person, or promote Jewish learning by being generous with his money to Jewish institutions of Torah learning. But promoting Jewish learning is his test. That's his test. That can't be changed. So now, when you have decided that it would be good for your circumstances to be changed, and you pray for it, you're facing really an uncertainty because you don't know what your Mazel Elyon is and what your Mazel Tachton is. You don't know what your ultimate challenge in the world is, which dictates circumstances that can't change, versus the circumstances you happen to find yourself under, and you could face that ultimate challenge in different circumstances. So when you pray for something, you might be praying for something that you can't have. Now you say, well, then I'm in danger. Isn't it bad to pray for something you can't have? Not necessarily. Not necessarily, because if you're supposed to pray for the things that you can have, it's a mitzvah to pray for the things that you can have. And God puts you in a circumstance where you can't know which are the things that you can have and which are the things that you can't have, then obviously God wants you to pray for all of the things you judge would be good for you, and he'll tolerate the mistakes. Otherwise, he would have given you a means to find out. When there was prophecy for 1,000 years, you wouldn't have this uncertainty. You could go to the prophet, and you could ask the prophet, what is my Mazel Elyon? What is my Mazel Tachton? What is my fundamental challenge? What can be changed? And you would know what to pray for and what not to pray for. When God took prophecy away from the Jewish people, what he said, the one thing that the message that he's sending is, I want you to operate in ignorance. And if that ignorance will cause mistakes, well, I caused the ignorance, and I gave you no recourse, so I'm taking responsibility for that. But I want you to operate under the circumstance of ignorance. Okay, so far?
What's the Masechet, just to know where?
I'm sorry?
In which Masechet of Talmud is written?
The story,
The Mazal.
it's in Shabbos, in Masechet Shabbos, I don't know exactly where. Yeah.
So just in the story, he says that Jews are allowed to change their fate under heaven with like great acts.
That's
so
right.
if a non-Jew were to do the same compassionate act, would they not have been able to change their fate?
They certainly wouldn't have been guaranteed. God can. We don't put God in a box. We don't say God can't do this and can't do that, but it wouldn't be guaranteed in the same way it is for a Jew. A Jew, there's a set of actions, and those actions take him above the mazel, and he can use them. And he's to a great extent he's in control of it, whereas a non-Jew would not be in control of it.
Even in something like Chesed, where both Jews and non-Jews can do just as much Chesed as each other.
Certainly something like Chesed, because the significance of your action depends upon whether it's a mitzvah or not. And if it's a mitzvah, it carries much, much more significance than if it's just something that you feel would be nice to do. And even as a mitzvah, if it's a commanded mitzvah rather than a voluntary mitzvah, a commanded mitzvah carries much more significance than a voluntary mitzvah. And chesed, loving kindness, generosity, for a non-Jew would be a non-commanded mitzvah. It would be a voluntary mitzvah. So even like someone who the Rambam says that any non-Jew who does any mitzvah at all, eats matzah at a seder in the spring, blows shofar in the fall, any mitzvah that he does other than Shabbos, he gets credit for. But he gets credit as someone who's invited to do the mitzvah, not commanded to do the mitzvah. So it's going to be much less significant for him than it would be for us.
So then if the Jew did the Chesed, but not because it was a mitzvah, not even for God, if the Jew was like a humanist Jew or something, and did the same Chesed,
Would be exactly the same.
would be exactly the same as a non-Jew.
Because we that's right, because
Okay.
we say mitzvahs shlichus kavana. Mitzvahs need the intention to be fulfilling the will of the Creator. So, for example, say putting on tefillin in the morning. Someone says, I have a brand new pair of tefillin, and if they fit you, I'll sell them to you. Try them on. So you try them on, and they fit you. You say, oh, we haven't talked about the price yet. Take them off, put them in the beginning. Now let's talk about the price, and we'll see if we can agree. Okay? Let's say you don't agree. Then you think, let's see, we didn't agree. I'm not buying the tefillin. But hey, I did put them on, didn't I? Well, I guess I did my mitzvah tefillin for the day. No, you didn't, because you put them on to try on the size. You didn't put them on to do what the Creator wanted you to do, and you have to go back and do it again. So that's not going to help.
Okay.
And that's,
So
okay.
it's just the idea is just that the extra mitzvot that Jews have are just so powerful that when we're doing it to serve the Creator, that creates an effect.
That's right. Very good, yeah.
So you mentioned something about we have a certain challenge, we have different circumstances, but we're in this state of sort of ignorance that the Creator put us in this position. So how do we make sense of it all, and how do we address what our challenges are and what our mission might be?
Well, in the specific circumstance that I'm talking about, you're supposed to pray for anything which you feel would be good for you. Now, I've used very vague language. There's a whole story about how prayer works. But let's see. The bottom line, without all the explanation, is you pray for something when you feel that it would bring you closer to God, when it would enhance your service of God. Now, since you don't know what your fundamental task is, you don't know whether it would enhance. You may pray for X, and X is inconsistent with the fundamental purpose for which you've been put in the world, so it won't enhance your service of God, because you don't know what the fundamental purpose is. Okay, so that prayer is going to be simply disregarded. So then you won't know. But it's like anything else. If God gives a certain amount of information and then blocks certain other information from us, so then he wants us to live without that information. And then, I don't know if I told you the story of Brian Weiss. This is a fascinating story. Brian Weiss is a psychiatrist living in Miami. About 30 years ago, when the technology was new, Ohr Somayach had a 3-city video conference. I believe it was in Passaic, and in Chicago, and in Miami. Rabbi Mordechai Becher and I were in Passaic and Chicago, and Brian Weiss was in Miami. And the subject was reincarnation. So we spoke about the Jewish sources on reincarnation, and he spoke about his psychological practice. He's a psychiatrist, but his psychological practice is taking people back to past lives so they can relive the traumatic events that took place in those past lives, and that helps them deal with their lives in this world. So, and there were audiences in all 3 cities. So someone in one of the audiences asked Dr. Weiss a question. She said, you help people by bringing them back to their past lives so they can understand where they've come from and how that affects where they are. Do you recommend that everyone should come to you to get that information so as to improve their lives? Rabbi Becher and I held our breaths. Wow. It's at least 1,000 people in the 3 audiences. He could certainly drum up a lot of business. To our delight and surprise, he said no. He said, I'm dealing with people whose lives are dysfunctional. Their lives are a shambles. They can't hold a job. They can't have a successful family and so forth and so on. I'm trying to save their lives. For people whose lives are going reasonably well, you can trust God that he will give you the information that you need to serve him well. We were so happy with that answer. That's the right answer. Coming from him, who doesn't have a classical Jewish education, and forswearing all the advertisement he could have had for all the people who need to come to him to find out about their past life. By the way, I'm not signing on that what he's doing is really genuine. I'm not signing on to that. I'm not committing myself on that. But that's the right attitude. So you don't really need to have that. But it's as much of it as you need, you will get. Now, there's one final point that I want to make here, and Ramchal says this explicitly. He says that these tasks are assigned with justice. What does that mean? It means that each soul has given primitive qualities. Souls aren't equal. They don't develop their qualities only afterwards. They come into the world with different identities. So that if the challenge is going to be poverty, then it's the soul which can respond to that challenge in a way to create the appropriate perfection. And another soul is born into a condition where the challenge is wealth, it's because it's a different quality soul. So we have to understand that the circumstances where we live under are not a mistake. They're not an accident. You hear people in various circumstances talk about, I don't really belong here, I don't belong in these conditions, I don't think I have to elaborate, right? But from a deep, deep point of view, that idea of just being a mistake is foreign to us. It may be that you're in a situation that's difficult to deal with, yes, but then you've been given the soul that's crafted to deal with that difficulty. And by the way, I mean misunderstood. I don't mean to say that if you find yourself in a certain circumstance that you should perpetuate that circumstance. That doesn't follow. The challenge may be to transform your circumstance into another condition. That could be the challenge. We're not talking about quietism now or passivity. But to say, I shouldn't have been put here. I should have started off someplace else. We don't say that. And that applies, by the way, to the development of Baalei Tshuva. About 40 years ago, the editor, a reporter from the New York Times, came to do an article on Ohr Somayach, and she asked Rabbi Schiller, who was one of the heads of Ohr Somayach, it is still, they asked him, would you call yourself born-again Jews? Like born-again Christians? And he said, absolutely not. Because we don't believe that you cut yourself off from your past. We don't believe that your past was a mistake. We believe that you were put into circumstances and you developed in a certain way, and then you came to a new opportunity, a new option, and you exercise that, and you bring along with you all of what you were before, but now it's going to be used in a different way, prioritized in a different way. So that's the sense in which your soul was chosen to be in these circumstances and deal with them, and then perhaps transform them, and perhaps act so as a way to get out of them. Absolutely. But not to think that you were misplaced. You know, the dice were rolled and you got a lousy number. That's not the way we look at it. So all of this is designed by infinite wisdom, and all of it is contributing to a success, which will be a collective success, as we have said. Together so far? I think if you understand this one principle, the fact that this gigantic problem, which all the philosophers wrestle with, philosophers of religion, Sadi Farado, on the basis of this principle, it just goes down the drain. Goes down the drain. Because from the point of view of divine wisdom and divine purpose, there's no reason why your circumstances should be dictated by your actions. That's the bottom line. Okay, then I'll just mention this because the next point. We said a half hour ago that in the previous chapter, he says we didn't explain why good people receive anything good, because the reward for mitzvahs is in the next world. So he says here, in different words, the concept that I told you was in the Rambam, Hilchos Shua Perek Tes, the Laws of Repentance, chapter 9. And this is based on statements in Chazal. A person who does a mitzvah, the opportunity and the struggle to do the next mitzvah, the opportunity is provided and the struggle is reduced. A person who has a whole program of doing mitzvahs, if he starts out doing those mitzvahs with difficulty, he will graduate to a time when it will become much easier. There's a feedback from your actions to the conditions that you live under vis-a-vis the difficulty of serving God. So positive acts of service breed a feedback of improvement of the conditions under which you serve. Maimonides points out, and he even asks this question, the promises in the 5 books of Moses, the promises of reward for, let's say, compensation for serving God are all this worldly. They're rainfall in the proper time, and plentiful crops, and good health, and long life, and success in your battles. All the promises that are explicit in the Torah, the Chumash, are promises of what we would call this worldly success, physical success. Okay, there are various hints, and there's the oral tradition about the world to come, but what are they there for at all? Let alone the fact that you don't have the same kind of prominence of promises for the world to come. Well, what about the reason for offering this kind of physical compensation? And if you tell me that reward for your commandment, for your performing the commandments is in the next world, what are all these promises for? And he says explicitly what we have said, that God says, I'll make it easier for you to perform mitzvahs. You'll perform more mitzvahs. You'll acquire more wisdom, which are the way in which that you get into the world to come. And you deserve that because of the effort that you have put forward when it was more difficult. So this is a response to what you do. And in the 9th chapter there, he calls it tchilas scharo, The beginning of his reward. So I gave you the analogy of giving someone the keys to the warehouse. The king says, you did a great service to me. Here are the keys to the warehouse. Take any package you like. Would someone say, but these are just pieces of metal? That's what you give me for a reward? Pieces of metal? This is tchilas. This is the beginning of your reward. Take the keys, open up the warehouse, and take whatever package you want. The fact that you are now have more physical support, the fact that you're healthier now, the fact that you're living in a period of peace rather than war, or plenty rather than famine, is the beginning of your reward in the sense that it makes it easier to do more mitzvahs and easier to acquire more wisdom. And the mitzvahs and the wisdom are what will get you into the world to come. So that's what the physical rewards are, the physical compensation or reaction to your actions are doing there. And this is a way in which a righteous person can enjoy good things in this world. He can enjoy good things in this world, not because it's reward, but because it's making his effort to serve God easier. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the compiler of the Mishnah and the editor of the Mishnah, one should not say the author of the Mishnah, he had a whole Bezdin, Rashi says this explicitly, he had a whole court of students who were studying with him, and they discussed and debated things back and forth, and he compiled the Mishnah from that. He was fabulously wealthy. He had a big palatial residence. His table was filled with all the delicacies all year round. He was fabulously wealthy. Before he died, he held up his hands and he said, I haven't had as much pleasure from this world as my little finger. By which he means, for this I have to give you more background, by which he means this: pleasure has various uses. A pleasure that will create gratitude towards God, you're required to take. You're not allowed to turn your back on that kind of pleasure. There are the pleasures of doing various mitzvahs like Shabbos and Yom Tov. You're supposed to have that pleasure. But a selfish pleasure, a self-experienced pleasure, a pleasure where, they talked about savor the taste, savor the aroma. What does savor mean? Forget about everything else. There's just me and my sensation. Cut everything else out. Blank everything else out. Just savor it. That's spiritual poison. The point of the pleasure is to link you to God, to cement your relationship with God. If you have the pleasure and you're filled with gratitude to God who made the pleasure possible, then it has a positive spiritual purpose. When he said, I never have as much pleasure as my little finger, what he meant was, I didn't have as much pleasure selfishly. So the wealth was there as a challenge, and he used it correctly. He used all of his wealth to connect with God. That's all he used it for. That's what he means. And then you see there that he was tremendously wealthy, and his service of God was exquisite. Okay? All right, have a wonderful Shabbos.